This meeting, thank you for coming, is for the benefit of Mark Herman and myself and the staff that is trying their best to design a game that's credible. And without showing our hand or discussing what we might decide, I thought it would be useful to get two briefings, which I think may be important to the game. We'll find out. And that is, one is to discuss the uncertainties associated with how large a device the North Koreans might be able to devise and place into low Earth orbit. And I think with any bad luck at all, we'll have a bit of a discussion that will, turn into almost a dispute, perhaps. But even if we have good luck, I think there'll be a range of possibilities that will be laid before us here. Now, in that regard, I picked my friend Tom Cochran, who off and on we've been in touch with one another since 1981. So that's pretty soon these years add up. That's how many? That's wow.
41.
Really? God, time flies when you're in pain. That's incredible. That many years. Okay. Well, so we're familiar with one another. He is a physicist by training and has spent most of his adult life focusing on nuclear public policy issues, and worked at NRDC, which litigates, and so it's an interesting background. Then we have Patsy Klein, or John Klein, take your pick. I think it's Patsy for him, so let's call him Patsy. And he has been attending an awful lot of our meetings and has both a military and industrial or commercial background. And he's going to talk about something else that I think will be very important. And that is, to what extent can you achieve the commercial and military missions that might currently rely on satellites in low Earth orbit some other way? I think that's going to be an important consideration for each of the teams when they try to deal with the likelihood that they might have to do that, and judging, how bad our situation is or isn't. Because I think a lot of people don't understand that there may be certain workarounds, and to what extent they work, we'll listen to. So with no further ado, I guess it doesn't really matter who goes first so much as who wants to go first. Any
Patsy raised his hand.
Who did?
Patsy.
Okay.
All right. Well, then, we should make all secret desires public, and it's over to you.
Okay. And just to confirm, you being an old Navy flyer, you want me to keep it to 15 minutes, right?
Henry, you just muted yourself.
Yes, I think if you can keep it to 15, no more than 20, that'll allow other people who are expert. I think some of you folks are very expert in the audience about these topics. If you go beyond 20, I will cut you off.
Okay.
And if you can do it in 15, terrific.
Cool. Well, thanks. Well, without further ado, I'm John Klein, call sign Patsy. Naval aviators aren't very original, so it's based off of Patsy Klein, the country music singer, in case you're wondering. Standard disclaimer, the views expressed are mine alone. I want to thank Henry and the JPEC team for last week's event, because it shaped a lot of the comments that I'm going to provide today or this evening. And I did see who's in the audience. There's some experts out there that are more cognizant of the information I'm going to be briefing, but this is my take on it. Next slide, please. All right, so the quick agenda. I'm going to give you the so what in case my like you experience what my classes do and I put you to sleep. But I'll give you what the bottom line is. We're going to talk about mission areas and orbits, which will be the good news part of the story. Some trends in satellites, especially since this game will have a primary focus on in LEO. Talk about some of the small sat trends. An important part is the loss of life potentially for this scenario for space stations, and then conclusions. Next, please. All right, so you got to keep it simple for folks like me. So in a picture, what are we trying to do? The scenario in 2029 has a nuclear detonation in LEO. My charge from Henry and the NPEC team was, what's the impact to the satellites in LEO? And I think somebody else needs to mute their mic. I'm hearing myself, which is a wonderful thing. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so post nuclear detonation in LEO, there's going to be other ways to get essential capabilities and services that we have from the space domain. We'll go over those shortly. But it's going to have, as you might imagine, a nuclear detonation is going to have significant catastrophic impact to the satellites in LEO. And I'll just paraphrasing, the radiation is going to stay within the LEO band. I think it was the terminology it was called tubes. And I think the radiation levels is going to be about 1,000 times more. So, we'll talk more about that. But all these thousands of satellites in LEO are going to get fried, and they're going to become debris. It's going to have a big impact on the LEO-reliant space economy, which we'll have a slide, but that's going to be in the tens to hundreds of billions of dollars in economic impact, and then, of course, the loss of life. Next. All right, so I put this slide together. Henry's probably changed a little bit, give you some more detail, but this is a good news story. This is mission assurance and resiliency, which basically says if something happens, can you achieve the missions and capabilities? So this is commercial and government capabilities. I color coded it for myself. Red is in LEO because that's where the primary part of the game is going to happen. And these on the left-hand side are the missions, standard mission areas that are relevant for this game. So we have GPS, PNT, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, missile warning, satellite communications, environmental monitoring, which includes weather, and then human spaceflight. You all, I think, it should be showing pretty good. But on the PNT side, hey, most of the stuff is in MEO. And based on last week's brief, I would say it's fair to say it's not going to have as big impact in MEO. And for gamisms, you could say a GPS and all the PNT systems are operational. There is talk about in the future to have some alternative PNT through commercial, and those would be in LEO, but it's still TBD whether there's a market. Regardless of that, I mean, there's some, on the right-hand column are all the other ways to perform those services or get those capabilities. So, we've been operating, navigating without GPS a long time before it came around. So you still have your radio beacons, your inertial navigation, and good old-fashioned maps and dead reckoning. On the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, we have government systems, which I won't touch on here, and they're primarily going to be in GEO and LEO. And the ones that are in LEO, a lot of the commercial partners, that's where they're going to be operating.
Hey, John?
Yes, please, Henry.
Dead reckoning. There are different kinds of dead reckoning. Some of the dead reckoning is super sophisticated, or might be. I just want to alert people that dead reckoning covers everything from trying to remember where you dropped your breadcrumbs to artificial intelligence, picking up data, not needing a satellite beam in an urban area to get you from point A to B pretty well, actually, assuming the photos are readable.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to amplify that dead reckoning meant a lot of things.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I was doing the old time, distance, speed type of stuff, but thank you for that. You're spot on. So back to the ISR. Hey, a lot of stuff in commercial. Leo's going to take out most. The new debt's going to take out most of that. Missile warning, primarily in geo and highly elliptical orbits. That was one of the questions that was kind of outstanding from last week. It's still TBD on those satellites and highly elliptical. Depends on how much time there and how much radiation hardening that they have. So I'll leave that as I left that off the table for suggestions for gameplay. But again, there's still terrestrial ways of getting around that. So the satellite communications, we have a lot of government systems, SATCOM. We have a lot of international entities like Inmarsat, Eutelsat, Intelsat, and we have commercial providers also. SpaceX's Starlink, OneWeb from the UK. So MEO, GEO, and LEO. And again, there's other ways to get communication, not necessarily providing the same coverage, but in a pinch, you could use cell phones, undersea cables, and other systems. On the environmental monitoring,
Can you hold up there?
sure.
Pete Hayes had a view about cables, I believe. What percentage did you think, Pete, of communication goes through undersea cables and cables in general? Is it a very small percentage, or what is it?
For total point to point, it's like 99% goes on fiber optics. Over.
So that's pretty significant. I guess your point, though, is that if you're moving around, you then you can't rely on a cable. You gotta have something like a cellular system handy, and if it isn't there, well, you might not be able to communicate. Is that the sense of it?
Well, I mean, my sense is so, undersea cables, it has terminals, so it's going to and from. But Pete's spot on, a lot of the traffic goes on the undersea cables, the fiber lines. But, satellite communications, it's, when you listen to what Elon has to say with Starlink and others, where there's not that infrastructure to places that don't have all the type of connectivity, it's bringing communications there. And there's the belief that there's a market. I saw Therese was on the line, but I don't think there's probably a market for everybody that wants to get into satellite internet. But there's a lot of venture capital coming that way. Okay,
If you're in combat, you aren't going to be using a whole lot of fiber optic cables to communicate.
Well, I mean, I think the context is, so yeah, you're going to have the military grade, the encrypted stuff, but for the rest of the world, the traffic's going to want to go somewhere. So I think the fibers, maybe not for fighting the war, but for the rest of the folks who want to still get their Amazon packages on time and like.
Some talk about putting up balloons for local, like cell towers, and that field seems to be growing. Are you going to include that in here?
We can. This is a thumbnail sketch. This is we have thousands of satellites currently. This is what I would consider the most, not everything, but potentially the most relevant for gameplay. Potentially is how I would characterize it. Again, yeah, there's
this its job because it's listening comments from people, and so we can throw in the word balloons as well. Also, keep in mind the game is going to be played in the year 2029, so there's some room for possible development. All right.
So on the environmental monitoring, I kind of in blue text, I have the NOAA weather satellites. In just my sense is I think that's going to be an underappreciated. So NOAA satellites, we have Lagrange Point 1 has some environmental monitoring, but there's GEO, the GOES, and then there's POES, there's polar orbits. The whole transportation industry uses weather forecasting a lot. So if you have if you have poor weather forecasting, you get a delay of a few days. I think, as we've seen with our fragile supply chain, I think there's going to be some second and third order effects that could affect the economy by taking out those LEO polar weather satellites. But we'll come back more to that at the end. And then human space flight. So we're going to we have the International Space Station. China's going to have their space station. We're talking about SpaceX and Blue Origin doing space tourism. So those, again, from last week's brief, it might depend on where the nuclear detonation happens. If it happens close or within a line of sight of the stations, I think you're going to get different effects than if you're on the other side of the Earth. Time. Okay.
Axiom Space will also have a space station up there by 2029.
Okay, great. And they're the commercial provider for station?
Yeah,
Stations?
absolutely. Yeah, so they're putting a module on, but the idea is that they'll take it off and then have their own space station.
Great. Thank you.
Oh, interesting.
Okay, next slide, please. All right, so the last one, so that was the good news story, and this is a little shout out for Satellite Industry Association and some of their briefings, and then for Bryce providing these two. But this is the sense, so there's ways to get those capabilities and services overall, but LEO's going to be trashed. This is just to convey, this is a big economy you're going to mess with. So it's not just military type stuff, it's the entire global economy and other folks who use it. So this is just to show 271 billion. Okay, next. Okay, so again, the game's going to be focused in LEO. I think all the effects are going to be pretty much with regards to that, at least the direct effects. But in LEO, we're seeing a lot more small satellites going up. So 94% of the spacecraft launched in 2021 were small sats. And if you see that number, 1743. And next slide, let's put that number in perspective. All right, so small satellites, this is the bottom left is CEO of Planet holding one of his doves. So the question was, are the satellites in LEO going to be radiation hardened to help with a nuclear detonation? The answer is no. There's just the essential, you're not going to add in excess weight or radiation hardening. Their typical refresh rate is they plan on replenishing a lot of these smaller microsats and doves types in about 18 to 24 months is their tech refresh. So that's to say there's no hardening, and the way they handle failed satellites is just with the next iteration that goes out. And there's some diagrams to show you the size of a person with a dove, and then a Starlink with the extended array. Next slide.
John, Patsy, do you have a sense of how long it would take for Planet to reconstitute itself if it had to? From zero?
I do not. It would depend on a few. I know they have a very good replenishment production line that goes quick, but it would depend on the launch vehicles. Post nuclear detonation, there's going to be a lot of folks scrambling, but it's going to take a while because the LEO orbits are going to be no good for up to 2 years, I think is what last week's briefing. So
no, I understand, but if you had stockpiled hardened versions for this bizarre event,
yeah,
how long would it take you to get all of them up and get the system up and going again? Would be the question.
So for essential stuff, I'll frame your question as if there was a high priority government customer that needed to get something back on orbit, regardless of what residual. If the bird was already built and being barned and co-located, you could have something up within days to a week, a couple weeks. Okay.
Well, we'll investigate that further as far as the constellation question, because you're doozies, it sounds like.
Yeah. So this one's just showing, hey, I love this number of commercial small sats launch has increased from 3 in 2012 to 1578 in 2021. Okay. So you can see the trend. Next slide. Again, more of the same. If you want to know who are the big players in small sat, commercial, and LEO, as you might guess, you see SpaceX, Planet, OneWeb, Spire, and Swarm. Okay, next slide. And if you want to know, based on the launching state and where they're licensed, hey, you can see the U.S. Is the primary, but for the game and for Mark, you saw this. It's going to be an international. It's not going to just be the U.S. It's going to be an international impact for their companies in LEO as well. And you can see China has something in there too. Okay, next. So why am I talking so much about commercial? Well, in comparison, for the last decade, this is the government small sat operators, and this is open source data. I think as a disclaimer, and they mentioned a little thing about Iran, but so it's the commercial folks who are putting up the large constellations in LEO, not so much the civil and the military side. We're talking orders of thousands to a few score here to less. Okay. Next. All right, let's not forget about, so those all were robotic satellites. Satellites don't have mothers, as the adage goes, but these folks do have mothers. And it's been my experience seeing other national security space war games. When you talk about dead humans, the response is a little bit different. So I won't bring up international humanitarian law or the law of armed conflict, but different countries may have different perspectives. Again, China's going to have its space station up there too, and they're taikonauts. As long as we'll say that we still have an ISS up there too. But let's not forget the people up there. Next slide. All right, I think I'm almost on time here. We'll wrap this thing up. So, hey, it's going to be a significant to catastrophic in LEO. I think the detonation won't have as much impact on MEO and GEO. You're going to have thousands of satellites becoming debris, and that failure could happen within days to months, depending on the detonation and where they are in that tube. You're going to have tourism and station impact, devastating impact to the LEO-reliant economy. What that is might be a separate analysis, but fair to say tends to hundreds of billions of dollars, whether it's direct or indirect effects. It's going to impact the U.S. and its allies and U.S. rivals too.
Could you slow down just a bit? Because our allowances are not measured in hundreds of billions per week, a lot of us are very impressed by hundreds of billions. But over what period of time is that hundreds of billions? Is that for a year? I mean, what is the?
I would say so. It would go back to that other slide where I said that the total space economy was 271 billion. So the question is, if you took out LEO, you're not taking out the stuff in GEO. So all those communications in theory may still work. So the question is, I would say probably over a 2 to 3 year time span until you can get up another constellations to start getting those services back. Again, that was somewhat speculative. I don't have in-depth analysis. It was more like, yeah.
Well, okay, it's a start. Of course, what is the GDP of the United States right now? What trillion is it?
I stopped keeping count. I think it was 3 trillion is the last I heard, but I'm not sure.
It sounds low, but maybe it's there. But the point is, in trying to understand this, we'll have to figure out sort of, what that number means in context with something else. That's all. Go ahead.
Okay.
Here we go. It's 20. You
Just
said
for the record,
it was 3 trillion?
no, it's more like 23 trillion.
Okay, good,
Uh-huh.
good. Google's a beautiful
Okay.
thing. Don't ask me anything. Hey, another part is the replenishment. Hey, we're going to just, hey, we got a bunch of failed satellites that are debris. Let's replace them. Uh, I think Leo's going to be unusable for a couple of years at best case. It would depend on the specifics. Okay, and we've already talked about the loss of life, and I think I'm at my time limit.
Okay.
Next slide for the questions. Cool slide.
Yeah, why don't we open this up for, I'd say 10, maximum 15 minutes for questions before we go into death and destruction in space, courtesy of nuclear, because they're so different. The topics are so different. On that note, why don't we open it up for questions, and you can either raise your hand, go into the chat room, and we'll collect those, or outbursts are allowed.
Hey, Mark, I see you have your hand up. Happy to engage.
Yeah, thanks, Patsy. Yeah, I guess full disclosure, Patsy and I were in another meeting together last week, so we did actually talk about this. But I think a couple things for the group is in terms of weather forecasting, Patsy captured it in that when you lose space assets, the forecasting becomes more and more local and less what the meteorologists call forecast skill. So right now, for example, with the current fleet of satellites, our forecast skill is 7 days and the Europeans is 14 days. So if you start losing satellites, then you're probably down to a 1 or 2 day forecast skill. So, so as Patsy said, you don't lose weather forecasting. It's just a lot more short term. I think with the subject of how fast could you replenish, I think if we took a look at programs like Starlink or OneWeb, how long, and in particular, how many launches it took them to get where they are now, I think that might be a good place to start. And the big difference, of course, is that all of these small sat large constellations all practice storage on orbit. So so I think they probably wouldn't have as robust an assembly line as satellite operators who store on the ground, which tend to be the bigger satellites and tend to be the more expensive satellites. So my gut says in the scenario, you're more likely to start replenishing the larger satellites first, just because you have 1 or 2 spare satellites in the barn on the ground, and then it comes down to launch opportunities being the forcing function.
Thanks, Mark. And you're spot on. So the cadence for SpaceX and their Starlink, I know routinely that they launch up to about 60 of their satellites at a time per launch. And they've been getting down to a pretty good cadence of 3 to 4 weeks for getting additional capability on orbit. But thanks for sharing the weather forecasting. I think that'd be an interesting discussion to see what the long-term impact is to the transportation industry. And spot on the excess capacity, like commercial folks are going to leave satellites laying around. They're going to get them on orbit, but you're going to lose all those spares after the detonation. So Mick, I see you had a few inputs here. Do you want to jump in?
I got to do something to stay engaged, right? I want to make an engagement instead of just listening. So yeah, just, you talked about the commercial small sats being pretty unhardened for radiation, but what about the government satellites, specifically DoD and IC sponsored small sats? I assume they're radiation hardened comparable to other stuff.
don't know exactly, but my sense is based on last week's, operating Leo, they don't get as much radiation as you would in MEO or GEO, but they're not going to, you're going to see the radiation 1,000 times higher post new debt. My sense is they're not going to be hardened. They might last a little bit longer than their commercial counterparts, but I think they're going to get fried within a month or so.
Okay, especially if DoD wants to use more commercial off the shelf stuff.
Yeah. And I don't know what's the replenishment rate. I mean, if there's some more important satellites that are in LEO, they may be hardened. But for the proliferated LEO, my sense is they're trying to use a lot of the commercial model, and I don't know if they're going to put that extra weight on orbit.
Then just real quick, if we're talking 2029, will the Space Defense Agency's missile tracking layer potentially be up by then? Which I'm not sure how many satellites that is, but it's supposed to be a lot in LEO, right?
Yeah, there was supposed to be some follow-on capacity. And actually, I was talking to some commercial folks who think, hey, if I can track wildfires, I can do missile warning, right? So potentially some players. But yeah, that stuff, they're looking at that aggressively.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the question.
I hope you don't mind. I plugged my old paper with Sam Wilson's on the value of space there. That has some stats on the weather data.
It's a wonderful paper. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks.
Let's see. Hey, Therese, if you're still there, did I characterize the state of the satellite industry okay?
Yes, you did. Thank you.
All right. And let's see here. Namrata, did I characterize, how about China's space station? I think it's going to be operational this year, right?
Yes. No, you characterized it perfectly, including their national satellite constellation. But yeah, I think it's going to be operational by the end of the year.
Yeah, Patsy, if I could just interject real quickly. I guess I found just this year on some research on Starfish Prime, from way back then in the early 60s, that there's actually a Russian cosmonaut, or Soviet cosmonaut, I should say, in orbit. And this during that, and the Soviets logged diplomatic protest against the new debt there, because of their cosmonaut in space and the risk to that person's life. So I just thought that was interesting. Yeah. Thanks.
And that was one of my unknowns. I know station has hardening. Is it going to be enough for 1,000 times the normal radiation levels? Is it going to be the time scale going to be months? A lot of stuff that I don't know about the hardening on station. But if it's a nuclear detonation nearby in proximity, that's going to be a different result.
Yeah. No, in terms of the degradation, Patsy, how we used to do it in one of my previous lives is that you take your radiation hardened critical components on the satellite. You knew what their maximum lifetime dosage was, and you just flew it through the cloud until you reached the maximum, and then the maximum design dosage, and then you would maybe put a fudge factor onto us and say, okay, if we're not caught in line of sight, this is how many orbits we have left.
I don't know if it's of any help, but I think it's the starfish decay rates at different L shells. And the stuff in the inner belt, they never did figure out if we've ever gotten back to the original levels at LEO. Mm-hmm. The whole belt may be totally artificial. But I've got about 6 or 7 years of the decay information at the different L shells if you want me to forward it to somebody.
Thanks. Mm-hmm. All right. Any other questions before I get off the stage? All right. Thanks for having me.
Yes. Well, I think that there we go. I think that's helpful. One of the things the game will have to struggle with is, it sounds like, is the immediate, which may be the station question, the midterm, which may be how do we go about replenishing what? The other immediate thing might be the military sats. One of the things that was raised was those missile detection systems. How much of a loss is that? And would someone take advantage of that loss? Is it that significant? And then finally, the long term. So staging and figuring out, each team is going to have to figure out how it assesses its immediate, mid, and long term concerns and remediation effort. Will be part of the game. I mean, I don't know how they'll play it, but they'll want to look at these charts, I think. So thank you.
Oh, thank you.
All right. Well, now that we've destroyed satellites in space, let's turn to the question of how big might the device be, and I guess the question originally that I tasked Tom with was a megaton device, but the bend in the curve, according to DITRA, which we've been told by both Greg Jones and Pete Hayes, is 10 megatons. That's a big device, it sounds to me, but I don't know. So when you're briefing, Tom, if you could make additional comments about whether 10 megatons is a bigger deal, literally, we're all ears. So let's listen up and see what we've got here.
Okay, well, Henry asked me to speak on whether North Korea could make a 2 megaton thermonuclear device by 2029. He didn't ask me to speak on whether it made any sense or whether they would do it or so forth, but I'm going to focus on the task at hand, which is, can they do it by 2029? If we could have the next slide, Brooke. So I just jotted down what I thought the requirements are for a country like North Korea to make a large thermonuclear device. And of course, the first thing you need is the materials, plutonium and highly enriched uranium. And in addition, probably medium enriched and so forth. And you'd want tritium and lithium deuteride. You'd need a cadre of experts, obviously, to operate a nuclear weapons design and construction program. You'd need the design for the device, some coding capability to design the device, and then a nuclear test program. So I'm just going to go through a couple of those. There's no doubt that North Korea has a cadre of experts. They've been testing since 2006, so they've been working on nuclear weapons program for a lot longer than that. So that's a given. The design, the basic design of a thermonuclear weapon, two-stage weapon, is been in the public domain for a number of decades. That doesn't mean anybody can make one. That just means basic structure of what you need to do is out there. So let's just quickly, the next slide, Brooke. On the material side, they have a nuclear reactor, obviously been running since the late 1980s. They've been using it to make plutonium for weapons that they've been testing. And they've announced that they're going to restart construction of a much larger reactor. So I don't see in the time period we're talking about any problem with getting the plutonium or tritium, which you could also make in the reactors. And they have a gas centrifuge enrichment program, so they can make adequate supplies of HEU. So I think it's a given that they can acquire all the materials they need for a large thermonuclear device. So let's go to the next slide. Coding. I simply point out that most of the U.S. weapons that are currently in the stockpile were designed with a mainframe computer, either the Cray 2 at Livermore or a similar computer at Los Alamos. The Livermore Cray 2 was installed in 1985, and the laptops you're using to view this presentation have better memory and speed than the Cray 2. So the computer capability is not an issue. And I don't think the coding is a particular issue because they've got a cadre of people that been working this issue for a long time, and they're not short on engineers or mathematicians and so forth. So next view graph, please. I just listed, this is from Wikipedia, the nuclear tests that have occurred in North Korea starting in October 2006 with a very small device. And there have been 6 in total. The last one has a substantial yield, some uncertainty, obviously, but it's it's in the 100 kiloton range. And the DPRK claimed it was a thermonuclear device, and you may remember they released a picture of it with the dear leader standing next to it. And whether it was actually a thermonuclear device is anybody's guess. You can't tell from the picture, but it had the right shape and so forth. But if you look at these 6 tests, and they're basically over an 11-year period. So they're capable, and the couple of these tests occurred in 2016 and one in 2017. So they're capable of testing it on the order of 1 test a year, which would mean between now and 2028 through 2028, that would be, they could easily conduct 7 more tests. So they have the testing capability to test a large thermonuclear device. And if we go to the last slide, the issue is, well, how big would this be, and how much would it weigh, and so forth. I think you should assume it would be on the order of 1 to 2 kilotons per kilogram. So if you're talking about a 2 megaton device, you're talking about a device that weighs 2 to 4 tons. And if you're up into the 10 megaton range, you're in the 5 to 10 ton range for the weight of the device, the mass of the device. And these numbers really come from plotting U.S. warheads. If you look at the 9 megaton W-53, which was the warhead on the Titan II, it weighed about 4 tons. And the smaller, but still a megaton range device, the W-56 on the Minuteman, it's in the 1 to 2 ton range. I mean, the 1 ton range, the half to 1 ton range. So that's a lot of weight to throw up into the region of the satellites. And probably other people on this call that are far better experts than I, whether their missile capability and the develop of their missiles is good enough to do that. My sense is if you got another 7 years, that's not a problem either. So that concludes my remarks, and I'm happy to take questions, although don't expect great answers.
Okay. Let me start off. We learned that the 10 megaton threshold is important because it's at that level in low Earth orbit that you can affect medium Earth orbit satellites and GEO. What is your prognosis on the ability to make a device with that large a yield that could be lofted into low Earth orbit, full stop, much less in the time frame we're talking about? What thoughts go through your mind with that?
I don't think there's any difference in the requirements and the probability of getting there between a 1 kiloton device thermonuclear and a 10 kiloton device.
No,
megaton. I mean, megaton,
okay.
excuse me. The design is essentially the same. It's larger, and you would use the coding to actually refine the design and convince yourself it'll work before you tested it. But and it's going to weigh a lot more. I mean, in the nuclear warhead business, the yield of 100% fusion of lithium deuteride gives you about 3 times the energy per kilogram as 100% fission of plutonium or U-235. So you're going to, when you're in that range, you're going to be using a combination of both actually plutonium for the primary, U-235 for the spark plug in the secondary, the center of the secondary, and assuming it's a spherical secondary, you'd probably have, and I'm not a weapon designer, but I'm just guessing something on the order 25 kilograms of HEU. You can make the outside surface of the secondary out of HEU, which would give you a lot bigger yield. But you know, whether it's 1 megaton or 10 megatons is really all about the size of the secondary, and you're going to have 10 times as much roughly as for the 10 megaton as for the 1 megaton.
From a weight and volume standpoint, we would like to know how practical it would be to loft that into low Earth orbit.
Yeah, and I gave you the figures in the last slide that I would use, which is, I would assume something between 1 and 2 kilotons per kilogram or megatons per ton. So,
You're talking about a 10-ton device?
if you're talking about well, let me just look at the W 53 on the Titan II 9 megaton device, and it weighed about 4 tons. So you're talking about having a missile that can lift 4 tons into low Earth orbit.
Say that again?
If you want to get up into the 9 or 10 megaton range, you're going to need to be able to lift 4 or so tons, metric tons of material up into that orbit area.
Just curious, amongst the experts here, how realistic does that sound, full stop, given what we know about their missile capabilities? Does anyone have any thoughts?
Well, again, you've given them another 7 years to build a new missile.
Henry, I don't have any answers, but I was thinking in terms of design. Would the North Koreans put a payload fairing around the weapon, or would it be exposed? Because I know that has an awful lot to do with atmospheric heating on the way up. So I don't know how that would affect the design or the performance, or whether they would even have the wherewithal to think about that kind of stuff.
And I know less than anyone else. I think you're muted. You're muted, Tom. You need to unmute yourself. You need to unmute yourself, Tom.
Oh, sorry. I say if you can build a rocket to carry 4 tons into low Earth orbit, I think you can build the shield at the top of the rocket.
Are there questions, comments?
Greg?
A quick question. Do we have any idea when you think they'll be able to launch a satellite? Because that might be the prelude to them being able to launch something dangerous into orbit.
Well, that's not my area of expertise. I don't, when you're getting into the missile area, you need to ask someone else. Maybe Greg can help us.
Is Greg still there?
I can
still
say
there.
that, sorry, just to answer that question about satellite launch. So they've already launched 2 satellites successfully to low Earth orbit. So, I mean, there are questions about whether they're functioning or we're capable, but they successfully launched it, the second one in 2012. So they have that capacity.
Do we know the size? The mass, I mean?
It's called the Kwama Yongsung satellites, but no, I don't know from the top of my head the size. Patsy, any
About
idea?
100 or 200 kilograms
Okay,
total.
all right.
All right. Let's see here. Mick, did you have something that you wanted to share with us, or have you already?
Yeah, it's a question, and if Tom can't answer it, maybe some other people can. I want to guard against us conflating getting into orbit. You know, we say low Earth orbit, they've orbited a satellite, because from what I understand, it's just an assumption, so correct me if I'm wrong, please, it's just the altitude, right? So it can go on a ballistic trajectory and blow up at 200 miles and never get into orbit per se. So having a satellite launch capability is not that relevant. It's just the ballistic missile capability. Am I wrong, or is that assumption on track? Thank you.
I think that wouldn't work because that would affect them just as much as it affect anybody else. In fact, it'd probably be worse for them. If you see what I'm saying, because it'd be too close to them when it went off.
Or Japan, perhaps, if it's going on a ballistic trajectory or something.
Yeah, that would be my guess.
You can still loft it so that it's not that close. I mean, but it's still lofted. You orbit. The Starfish Prime wasn't in orbit. It was just launched by a Thor.
And it took out Hawaii.
Yeah.
So I just want to make sure we're not thinking that you have to have satellite launch capability and get into orbit, because that's a whole different level of technology than to put a missile on a ballistic trajectory and get up to 200 miles in orbit.
Mick, is it your thought, or the thought Greg and others have, that you could loft it in a fashion that would get you a fair distance away from having impact, friendly fire problems?
I would like to defer to other experts, but from what I remember from my astronautical engineering class 30 years ago at the Air Force Academy, the most efficient ballistic trajectory is 45 degrees. So if you're launching at 45 degrees, going 200 miles in altitude, I mean, you're going to be way past Japan by then, or way over Thailand or the Philippines or Australia or something.
I see.
And so it's not going straight up. It's going on a ballistic trajectory. That's the level of my knowledge, so I defer to others.
Well, you've introduced
any ballistic missile works.
I would also offer that as the rocket's going up, the Earth continues to turn. So, you know, they're moving out of the way.
I think that's what he was referring to.
It's more than that. No, it's both effects. In other words, you're going off at an angle to begin with. If you went straight up, the planet's moving under you. If you go at 45 degrees, you're getting, separation in distance, plus the Earth is moving.
Yes. No, it sounds right.
And actually, ballistic missiles use flatter than 45 degrees. 45 degrees is only if I'm shooting an artillery piece like 10 miles or something. Ballistic missiles are more like 25.
That's probably why I got a C in that astronautical engineering.
Yeah. Well, I think going back to another previous life is that seeing something like this come out of North Korea, would that make us want to shoot at it with a ground-based interceptor and or an SM-3 if an Aegis happened to be in the area? Might be an interesting thing to play through.
THAAD ashore deployed in South Korea.
Yeah. THAAD is terminal, though. I don't think it could get it outbound.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
I think you're raising interesting questions, because the right there in that little exchange you had, well, terminal missile defense, which would be all the way to THAAD for sure, not so helpful.
Mm-hmm.
SM-3, maybe, but what we'll have in 5 more years, or I should say 7 more years, is that going to change?
Yeah.
I'm just curious. Does anyone know the answer to that? I mean, what is the likely state of missile?
The real issue is that if you're going to use an SM-3 to shoot something down up on ascent, you have to be within like 15 degrees of the angle, the direction it's going in. That's one of the reasons why they're still talking about lasers are the only real thing that are, faster, much faster than the rocket. So that's really, and I don't know where there was a Boeing airborne laser system. There was the Navy's working with a system. So I don't know where the laser programs are, but that's kind of the things that might actually do something.
Mhm.
Is Pete Hayes with us?
Yes, sir. I agree with that last comment. It's very hard to use any kind of terminal defense to go after something.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, even in this scenario, GMD, my old program, basically relies on about a 10 to 15-minute coast phase.
There you go.
And you know, if they were just going to shoot this and then detonate it in space, you probably wouldn't have time to even go after it with a ground-based interceptor.
Mark, you know what this highlights? It's that this idea that the game would agonize for a long period of time as something orbited may or may not be realistic.
Mm.
I mean, one of the things we got to think about is, I mean, it's fun to have that time because you could, use that to compress people's conversations, but we may have to think about this.
Yep. Mhm.
Along those lines, I have two issues that I thought I might bring up. One is there's a thing called a polar cap absorption event. That is when you have a major coronal mass ejection from the sun. It comes out, it hits over the polar caps, and it can go as far south. They've seen them as far south as Mexico City, and all the communication goes out, everything goes out, and they use it as a simulation of a nuclear weapons blast and testing communications. So my first question is, could we differentiate if they launch during one of those events? And there is some warning for that. So should that be in the scenario? The second question, almost related, is during the first Gulf War, they were very concerned that a large meteoroid, like a 10 or 20 kiloton meteoroid blast might occur in the vicinity of Israel, and that would bring Israel into the war. The point being there, I have charts that we have from the DSP and from some others that show hundreds of these bursts going off of at least a kiloton to 10 kilotons. And the question is, are they nuclear or not? In fact, we thought South Africa may have exploded 2 nuclear weapons. It turned out later that they concluded that it was actually large meteoroid impacts. So my question to you is, could these hide, or would we have to dither to determine whether Korea had launched something or whether it was a large meteoroid? Should those be considered in this scenario?
I'm reminded of a briefing where I was told that if the Iraqis knew, as surely they must, the most classified ways of making nuclear weapons, they'd have at least 50 of them already. That was a possibility too. It only highlighted how complex the uncertainties were. I don't know, but it sounds like we're still agonizing over whether, and I need to ask the group, would the North Koreans have the likely capability of launching at least a 10 kiloton device into orbit? And I think the answer, judging from what I'm hearing, is perhaps, but that when you go to heavy things, you're going to have to do a lofted trajectory. So now how am I doing? Or is someone please contradict me?
I think you're correct. The only reason I brought up the orbital thing is that allows a very definitely different scenario in which they can threaten to blow that off. But that all brings me back to the same point. The Chinese are going to be really upset in any of these scenarios, and they kind of hold the keys to North Korea.
Yes, well, you have just asserted one possible premise, and we're hoping the game will highlight a number of other possibilities as well. They might not be, we don't know.
Henry?
Okay. Yeah.
I want to throw a wrinkle in your game.
Well, God knows there aren't enough yet.
Yes. Some years ago, I attended a talk by the head of National Defense University who was a general who had been the head of U.S. forces in South Korea. And in his speech, he said, when you think about North Korea, you should think about it as a crime family, not as a country. So I don't know how that fits into your game, but
Well, it just reminds me of all the people I deal with. I mean, how could this be a wrinkle? This is normal. I don't know that that changes anything, but it does sound technically that what's been revealed here is that if you're thinking about a very large device, it may be possible, but it would require a lofted trajectory, and a smaller one, maybe not. Maybe you could get that into orbit, and that changes a good number of things as to the design of the game.
well, the objective of a crime family is to stay in business as a crime family, and I don't see how this firing off a 10-ton thermonuclear warhead is going to help them in that regard.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. And that one I take. That's a good point. So much damage, not everything. But of course, it could be that just doing the other smaller explosion puts them in a bad way that way as well.
Doesn't that give them a chip that they can play? You know, we'll drop that on you, or they don't even have to state. They just let everybody vaguely know that that's what they got up there, and they can use that as a threat to blackmail.
Well, yes, that at the very least.
And that's crime family, right?
Yeah, that's not much of a game though. So we may have to make them insane as well as criminal. Other questions, comments?
There were a few hands that were raised. JR had his hand up first, and then I think it was Mr. Jones was next.
Okay, absolutely.
Okay, so a couple of things came out. Is it, I guess one of the questions I have, the radiation is the big concern. So is it really important to have a multi-megaton weapon or a smaller weapon that you can loft up that's a lot dirtier to throw a lot more radiation out? So that's one point. And another point, Henry, that kind of goes into...
Can we stop right there? Let's stop right there for the moment and see if we can get some comment. Silence.
Now, the dirtiness you're talking about isn't the same dirtiness that we're concerned about for the satellites.
Yeah, usually when you talk about
You
a
don't
dirty...
put cobalt in it or something.
Yeah.
What I think what you're really worried about, I mentioned this before, is when we actually do the calculations, what we worry about is the energy density from the plasma. And trying to figure, given that, you can work back what the radiation dose to the satellites is. And we usually, I think I was trying to tell you last time that we have charts where we've worked out what the saturated weapons environment. In other words, they put up a lot of little weapons and they just keep pumping them. There's a limit to which how much you can pump up the belts before they just break open and all the particles escape. It happens to be the magnetic field density, B squared over 8 pi versus 1/2 mv squared from the bomb. And you relate those two, and that gives you the maximum energy that you can put into the field before it breaks open. And from that, you can calculate back to what the dose on the satellites are. I have some charts that give those values. And so
I thought we were mainly concerned about the fission yield and the beta decay of the fission products, not the plasma from the burst.
Well, what we're talking about is at the weapons lab, what they were worried about is the long-term effects of the radiation belts that were enhanced. They were trying to track the starfish and Argus, how long it took for them to decay, because they create a long-term dose. And they didn't wipe out the satellites right away. It was over months, even over a year, that they seriously degraded the entire LEO environment of satellites. Reason Van Allen was so popular was his is one of the only satellites that actually survived through all those through that dose. And I was actually sent at Air Force to go into the hallowed vaults of Iowa to see if we could get his radiation damage data. He wouldn't give it to us. He wanted to be paid a lot. But that's what we were working on.
Can I ask a question going back to this? There was a calculation earlier. What would a 20 KT warhead weigh? I remember it was on a chart. I don't have the chart in front of me right now. What was that number? It was a chart. I don't have it in front of me, so I can't remember until I get a copy. But
Tom is
We got-
muted, Mr. Cochran.
Mr. Cochran, unmute yourself.
Let me just look at a graph I did years ago. If you're in the weapons in the sort of 20 kiloton range, you're probably down around 1/10 of a kiloton per kilogram rather than 1. So the yield to weight ratio would be a lot less.
so wait, so 1/10. What you just said, 1/10 of a ton per kiloton. So it's 20 times 20
yeah.
tenths, right? So two tons.
Yes.
Okay, and okay, that's all I need to know.
Well, a 10 to 20 KT weapon isn't going to weigh 2 tons.
No, I was going to say.
The AN-52, the French AN-52 didn't weigh anywhere near that.
I'm just trying to get a number because I'm trying to figure out if they can launch, so many kilograms back in 2012. It sounds to me like it's not a stretch to say they could put in orbit a 20 KT warhead in 2029, given their rate of advance in these things.
Well, they've already got 100 kiloton warhead that they've tested.
Well, more
Right,
important.
Can they put it
is
in
the
orbit?
weight.
The weight is, I don't know. It's a weight to put it in orbit. It's, the calculation for getting escape velocity and all that to get into orbit. 20 would be easier than 100, obviously.
Right. But Greg, can you speak up? Because I think the idea that a 20 KT device weighs 2 tons strikes me as nutty. It's way too high.
No, it doesn't.
Well, but let's hear from Greg.
What I'm saying, if I were going down to 20 kilotons or somewhere in that range, I would be using about 1/10 of a kiloton per kilogram. So you're talking about something that doesn't weigh very much.
Could you give us a range?
I don't know if you got, you probably don't. I had co-authored a book, volume 1 of the nuclear weapons data books. And there's a chart in it. I'll tell you what page, on page 36, where we plotted the yield to weight ratio of all the warheads in the U.S. arsenal. From
Well, that's handy.
Fat man all the way up to the B-83.
Okay.
Well, in volume 5, which you weren't one of the authors of, the French AN-52 warhead weighed about 500 kilograms. And that's a decent weapon that would produce something like 10 or 20 KT. And it's not that hard. In fact, I imagine the North Koreans already have a weapon, something like it now.
So there's your answer.
So according to what was said earlier, they basically could launch that even today if they tried to.
Well, they've only put like 200 kilograms, but presumably they could get 500 kilograms in orbit with these larger missiles.
Okay, good enough.
All right. Greg, did you want to speak further on some issues?
I have actually a question for Tom. Is that where would you test a 10 megaton weapon? Nobody's ever tested 10 megatons underground. I think I forget the yield of the thing they tested in Kamchatka, but most of these things that were tested underground are less than a megaton. So I don't know. Are you saying you think the North Koreans would test this thing above ground, or what?
They'd probably do what the Soviets did and do an atmospheric test, and they could probably aim it south. Just do it over the ocean somewhere. But your guess is as good as mine.
Well, presumably for purposes of the game, that test either had been done before or not. And if it's not, you're what I think Greg's highlighting is it would be highly unlikely that you would be convinced they could do it unless you had known they'd already tested it. Is that your point, Greg?
I just don't think the North Koreans are going to try to launch this thing into Leo and detonate it without having some idea that it's going to work.
Okay.
We think,
Right.
believe it or not, I think they're going to have to worry about that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's helpful. That's helpful.
They could take it out on a ship somewhere.
Right. But I mean, I think that the point remains that for purposes of game design, the credibility of a claim or a concern about a 10 megaton device would turn on whether or not we had actually yet seen it tested somehow, some way.
Yeah, the more I think about it, I think the logical thing to do would just be to take it out on a ship and park the ship somewhere and fire it off.
This is for purposes of a test?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Right.
I agree with Greg.
Okay.
The question keeps coming back. What would the Chinese think of something like that?
Well, you'll have to actually participate in the game to find out. I mean, one of the concerns we have is to what extent they're going to want to side with our concerns or not. And it's just there are reasons to believe that it could cut in lots of different ways, rather than it's obvious they would see the merits of seeing things the way we see things. That's all. All right. Well, Pete, Pete Hayes, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I just looked up some stuff about how much our warheads weigh. So I put that in the chat. So our B-61 common warhead weighs about 700 pounds. That has definitely 200 or 20 and more kiloton yield. And going back to the original questions, I mean, I think it's unlikely that the North Koreans are going to have capability to put 4 tons into Leo by 2029. I don't see any evidence that they're building systems that big and capable. And then that gets back to just lofting it up, which that would be easier than putting it into orbit. And, going back to the defenses, I don't think there's any chance you're going to get it with terminal defense capabilities. Over.
Well, we're approaching now 90 minutes, and I don't know if it's true, but I've postulated that virtual reality ends at 90 minutes. Perhaps all reality does, but I did want to although Mr. D is not with us. We'll find out what happened there. There is another person who will be, we expect, working and helping us support the games that I wanted to introduce. Kat, are you visible to the remaining audience?
Hi.
Oh, there you go. There you go. Well, there you. Oh, that's nice background. Very good. Yes. And Kat will be helping out as well. So, you know, faces to be familiar with. And I think with that, unless there are other comments and questions, this was very helpful. I think this is very helpful. This is the last of the preparatory meetings, is it not, Andrea?
Yep, this is our last one. So,
Okay. Well,
as I said before you joined, we'll communicate with you all a lot before the war game itself, but this is the last meeting.
Okay. And the meetings next most likely are the end of June?
The game itself, yeah, is June
Yeah.
27th, 29th, and 30th, 5 to 8 p.m.
Okay. Well, there we go. On that note, I'm going to bid everyone a good evening.